In this video, I'd like to help you get started with writing a scientific paper. I'm designing this video for both graduate and undergraduate researchers in STEM disciplines. That's science, technology, engineering, and math. I myself am a STEM professor, particularly electrical and computer engineering, at a university in the United States. The very first thing I'll tell you about writing papers is that you do not start by writing an introduction. This is contrary to what people will tell you in non-STEM disciplines like history or political science or some sort of persuasive paper. The reason for this is that STEM papers are data-driven, so data takes a central role in writing a paper. So briefly, let's just identify the important parts of a scientific paper. Generally, you have an introduction. This is very important to provide a conceptual overview and a context for what's going on. You may also introduce the motivation. Here you can discuss why you're doing what you're doing, what need it addresses, or what advantage it provides over existing solution. You also may want to discuss your approach very briefly. This describes your method maybe in a sentence or two, and maybe give a teaser of what your main result is. Next, there may or may not be a background section. This will be like the introduction, but it will provide more details, so it may feel repetitive, but that's okay. You're expounding, adding more details, citation. Next, you may want to give an outline of the paper, and you give a brief overview of what's happening in each of the other sections. Next, you may have a methods section. Here you'll discuss how you get your data. You may list scientific equipment and identify specific procedures that you use to gather your data. Or you may introduce mathematical theory or physical theory. After this, you are generally in a good place to discuss results. Here you'll present your data in graphs and plots. They should have captions, and there should be text that helps readers interpret all of that and synthesize it. Next, you may or may not have a discussion section. This can help the reader interpret results. You may find it more fitting to include it in the results itself. And then finally, there may be a conclusion. The conclusion summarizes your results, and it may often be fairly repetitive of the introduction. You really have a chance here to deliver the reader the punchline of the paper and tell them what you want them to take away. Now that I've given you the outline of a paper, I'm going to tell you that you do not write it in that order. It may seem counterintuitive, but there's a very good reason for writing it in another way, and I'm going to show you that now. When you write a paper, because it's scientific or it's a STEM paper and it's data-driven, the most important place to begin is with a story. Some writers may call this a hypothesis. Let me give you an example of what a hypothesis might look like in my research, because my research group were computational researchers. So our hypothesis might be that molecule X or material X is suitable for some particular application. Another example might be that we have a particular model for a physical process. The next step then is to gather data. The hypothesis or the story you're trying to tell influences the data that you're trying to gather. In my research group, this might be some sort of calculation or computer simulation or model. Other research groups might want to do an experiment, and then they might take some measurements. The next step is to visualize and analyze data. Here you will take your raw data and make plots, charts, tables, other things that will help you see what's going on with the data. Very important questions to ask about the data are, is it valid? Very, very important. Because if you don't have valid data, then you have to go back to the data gathering part. But you usually don't pick up on this until you visualize and analyze it. The other thing you want to look for are trends. Is there something in the data that contradicts or upholds the story you were trying to tell? So once you've identified trends, the next thing you want to do is you explain those trends. And I'll show this as a decision point. So we identify trends. Can we explain them? If the answer is yes, then we'll say, congratulations, your story is consistent with the data. And then you can go on. Now, in the case that you can't explain your trends, that's not the worst thing ever. There could be a couple of things going on, right? So it's possible that your data is wrong or invalid, or it's possible that you discovered something new. And that's always exciting. But if you've decided that you've discovered something new and you're learning something here, then that actually means that you want to refine or adjust your story or hypothesis. So as you refine and adjust your hypothesis, it may mean that you have to gather more data. That may mean that you modify your molecule, redesign your molecule, or redesign your material, or change the model, some feature of the model that you're designing. It may mean that, if the system you're studying is too complex, you zoom in and you study one smaller part of it. Just like when you're troubleshooting complex machinery, well, it's hard to troubleshoot the thing as a whole, but rather you zoom in on this component or that component. So you isolate things, you reduce the scope of what you're studying, and that may mean that you need to gather different data. And you'll keep going until you have a refined hypothesis and data that supports it. Once you get to that point, congratulations, you can begin writing your document. So what you do first, because this is all data-driven, you want to make some production quality figures, tables, and graphics. And you also want to write captions for these. So this is like the skeleton of your story. Once you have that done, you can then write the results section of your paper. So now you're adding text. After you write the results, then you can begin to write the methods part of the paper. And once you have the methods done, then you can begin to write the background. And after that, your story is really taking good shape, and I would then write the introduction and conclusion. By the time you get to the introduction and conclusion, you have a well-developed story, and it will be time then to write the abstract of the paper. So I'll point out that you don't just sit and write this in one sitting. It may mean that you write some for a half an hour, or 90 minutes, go do something else, and you do it again. It takes time to write and iterate. Writing a paper is just that. You have to iterate over and over until you have a nice polished result. So don't be surprised if you have to go back and do this over and over again. Just a couple of tips on this. I'll draw a line here. And, when you have a story consistent with the data, we'll say this is converged. And it may be tempting to write the narrative before you have a story that's converged. So I'll put here, this is too early. The temptation here is that, you could spend a lot of time writing a beautiful narrative and a beautiful introduction and background and all of this. But if you're not converged on your story and the data yet, you may very well end up having to change the introduction and the background and the methods that you wrote already. So you really want to save that for later. It really will help you with efficiency because you don't want to have to change all of that over and over again. So you want to first converge your story and the data, and then you go ahead and start writing other things. Same thing, you don't want to get out of order on this sequence from figures to results, methods, background, and conclusion. The reason being, the text in the results depends on the figures, and you want to write in a way that's concise. That's what we, in science, in STEM writing, you have to be concise and correct and clear. You don't want extra ideas that don't matter. Again, the text of the results relies on the data, and the methods that you use really depend on the results, because if you're still refining your results and maybe you decide you need more data, well, then maybe you need a new technique, then you're adding methods. So after you do these things, then you write the methods, and then you want to make sure that you don't write any of these, the background, the intro, or the abstract before. It's like putting the cart before the horse, really, because for efficiency, you want just enough background to understand the methods and the results that you're presenting. If you have extra background, it will confuse the readers, because they'll start to wonder, well, I just read about the general theory of relativity, but now you're telling me about the sleeping patterns of a lemur. Like, what is going on here? So you really want the background to be exactly what the reader needs to understand the story you're presenting. And the intro and the conclusion are meant to help the reader focus their mind and their attention on the right things. So again, you want to write these after you have the background and the methods and the results in place. Otherwise, again, you may be leading the reader in a wrong direction, and you may be confusing them if your introduction contains information that's not relevant to the rest of the paper. And that's easy to do if you write the introduction first, before you have a good grasp on the rest of the story. And then the abstract is a more condensed version of the intro and conclusion, so that really needs to come last. So I hope you find that helpful. We discussed the major parts of a scientific paper, and we discussed a workflow for writing this. And my warning is that it's really not like writing a paper in the humanities, where you start with your introduction and then you build an argument to support it. Here it's data-driven, so you start with the data, the results, the figures, and then you build the methods, the background, and the intro, conclusion, and abstract off of that. That will be hopefully the most efficient and effective method for you as a STEM researcher. If you found this helpful, please like and share the video, subscribe to my channel, and Godspeed and good luck as you write your paper.